Despite a large and diverse field that started with nearly 30 candidates, unprecedented amounts of fundraising and voter interest, some Democratic donors are grumbling that they don't like the toys they've been playing with and they want a new one. The New York Times quote, with doubts rising about former Vice President Joseph R. Biden's ability to finance a multi-state primary campaign, persistent questions about Senator Elizabeth Warren's viability in the general election, and skepticism that Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, could broaden his appeal beyond white voters, Democratic leaders are engaging in a familiar rite, fretting about who is in the race and longing for a white knight to enter the contest at the last minute. Talk about the sudden angst. I'm joined by Neera Tanden, president of the Center for American Progress, and Christina Greer, associate professor at Fordham University. You know, Neera, I like the fact that this was framed as a kind of perennial right because I remember
because it is.
It is, and I remember in 2004 there was the Wesley Clark boom. Everyone looked around. They said, "Oh no, we need the NATO general, Wesley Clark. I love Wesley Clark." I was like, "Well, he's not a great candidate." There was Fred Thompson on the Republican side who's going to be the savior. What is the psychology here?
Oh, I think the psychology is that Democrats, it's sort of a congenital condition to worry and have agita. And I think that is exacerbated by Donald Trump, who, Democrats have carnal fears about his ability to destroy, people in his path, Republican, Democrat, frail humans, anyone in his path, he has a kind of ability to destroy. So I think there is those things combined to create a lot of agitation. I don't think it's just amongst Democrats. I think Democratic donors, I think it's around a lot of people. But I would say, just like in past election cycles, the nominee is likely, almost I'd say 100% likely, but likely to be one of the candidates running. And whoever emerges from this contest will seem strengthened because that person will have defeated so many other people.
That's the point, Christina. Like, to me, it's always about the fact that campaigning exposes the candidate's weaknesses. That's the process of campaigning because people attack them on stuff. They hold them to account. There is no shrink-wrapped, perfect, off-the-shelf candidate in American politics.
You're right. And we saw in 2007, 2008, Barack Obama became a much better candidate because of his, long battle with Hillary Clinton. But I think what we really need to focus on, besides the fundraising, is the fact that, the Democrats tend to focus on the people we don't have instead of the people that we have at the dance, right? And so we have, the fact that Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote. So we have the fact that we now have Democratic governors and lieutenant governors who are young and inspiring in Michigan and Wisconsin. We have the fact that we have black women who have been mobilizing folks, and we shouldn't wait until November 1st to ask them to come out. And we should also look at, mayors in the South and black mayors who put together winning coalitions all across in 2018 and sort of see what they did and what issues really motivated their citizens to come out and support them. So if we put that together, then we can choose a candidate that we can help get across the finish line on November 3rd in 2020 instead of thinking about, Bloomberg or all these people who are just sort of flirting with the idea of the presidency each year.
Partly, too, I think, Neera, to your point about the congenital aspect of this is sort of perpetual worrying. And part of it is that, people were shell-shocked by Donald Trump winning. But if the situation were reversed, if it was a Democratic incumbent who was polling at 40% and getting impeached and had all these scandals, Democrats would be losing their mind. They would be convincing themselves that Democratic incumbent was headed for certain defeat, that they were going to lose by 15 points. And there would be op-eds about how they have to resign and you got to get out of the way. If you put the shoe on the other foot.
It's not clear exactly which is better for democracy, frankly. You have a Republican Party impervious to facts. Absolutely, You're 100,000% right that Republicans look at terrible facts and just, beat their chests and say they'll win no matter what. And Democrats look at a winning hand and worry about every ability to lose their hand. And, this is just sort of makes what Democrats are like underdogs and Republicans like the Yankees. But it's sort of but I think the thing to focus on here is that you're absolutely right. Donald Trump is the most unpopular incumbent in American history in polling that we've had. And he faces a very difficult election. And I'd say that the lesson of 2018 is that Democrats were able to put together broad coalitions. They were able to actually attract moderate voters and bring out millennials and their base, people of color, students, young people. You can actually do that in the face of Trump, and we should think of the way to do that. And I think a lot of these candidates, I mean, our primary is really long, but a lot of these candidates to Democratic voters, 70% of Democratic voters think that one of these candidates can beat Trump. So it's not everybody who thinks this way.
Quickly, Christina, a lot of that work can happen independent of the candidate.
Yes, indeed. And we have grassroots organizations who are doing it. We have, elected officials on the local level who are doing it. And just to remind Neera, the Yankees lost. So it is possible to defeat the Republicans.
Exactly.
And just because they say that they're going to win doesn't mean that they can win.
That's exactly right. The Yankees lost. Neera Tanden and Christina Greer, thank you both for joining us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.